Welcome to the Becoming Body Smart podcast, where we unlock the secrets of sustainable health and fitness and help you master your health habits. If you're tired of quick fixes, generic blueprints, and chasing short-term results, you're in the right place. It's time to become body smart.
So, welcome on this bright and early morning. Not quite bright yet, but brightening. So I definitely need your help and your comments and questions and things like that. Since I'm flying solo, unless you want to hear me just ramble for the whole hour, or half hour. I would love any questions, comments, things like that you might have. What I want to talk about today is partially inspired by that Blue Zones show that on Netflix that we've talked about a little bit. I would love for all of you to watch that. It's something that we want to talk about more. We'll do kind of a whole recap, but one of the points of that show, or one of the themes of that show, is something that I find to be very, very true and important, and something a drum that I have beat for quite a while, about kind of how we should live versus how we do live, and it's mostly been I guess my opinion on that has mostly been formed by observing people's metabolisms and doing thousands and thousands of metabolic tests on people and seeing how our metabolisms now are working versus kind of how they were shaped, what caused our metabolism to be the way it is. And so we definitely need to go back to what we used to do, and how our lifestyles used to be in some ways, because our current metabolism, our current body, was shaped through thousands of years of what's called speciation, or the genes surviving in the gene pool that led towards better adaptation. And what we were adapted to was a very different lifestyle than what we're currently living. Really, it was only the last couple, maybe 100 years, where sitting became a thing, where people had jobs, desk jobs, where industrialization made it so that machines were doing the work and we were kind of along for the ride, instead of the one doing the work. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just we need to figure out then in our lifestyle how we're going to account for that, how we're going to make up for the movement that we used to get that we no longer do. And so, fascinating concept. And that Blue Zone show kind of helped remind me of that, and gave me some examples of those blue zones, those areas in the world where people are doing that, where they are living that way, and they're living much longer, healthier lives because of that. So living like our ancestors, kind of the framework of what I want to cover today is how living like our ancestors, those lessons from the past, some of the things that they did was they were constantly moving all the time. Real regional, not movement, real regional food. Oops. I posted in their real regional movement. Real regional food. They ate real food from their region, and in their season, they were eating it. And then they lived in tight communities, and they have a purpose to their life. So we'll talk more about each of those things. But really interesting how in each of the cultures that were blue zones that they visited, those seem to be the themes. And only one of them lived in kind of a more, well, two of them lived in a more modern society. The rest of the blue zones very much lived old world lifestyles. And so I thought that was pretty fascinating. So one of the elements that they all had, though, is that people were constantly moving. We sit so much in our current society, right? In our current way of life and lifestyle. That's just what we do. We sit. We aren't up and moving and doing all the time. It used to be that we literally had to put food on the table, that we had to make that food, that most of what we did all day, every day was prepare our next meal. And so we were outside gathering the food that we needed to gather, preparing the animal that we were going to eat if we had meat, but most of the time it was mostly fruits and vegetables and grains. Um, Most of our food was locally sourced and in season, all those types of things. So that real regional food, um, those things were just staples of our lifestyle, that we were constantly moving and eating real food that came from our own farms. And it turns out the people that are still living the longest today, a lot of them are doing those things. And what was interesting is it wasn't just the people that were living the longest. It was people that were still riding horses at 104. It's people that are still like farming and getting up and down from the floor and able to still live a healthy, active lifestyle late in their life because they were able to keep moving. And that was just such a big key to see, that they were able to um, not have such a sedentary lifestyle. The getting up and down from the floor in one of the areas in Okinawa, they don't have furniture. They sit on the floor. And so they were getting up and down from the floor like it was no big deal. So they were doing like 30, 40 up downs, getting up from the floor and sitting back down, 30 or 40 of those a day. Imagine if we were to do that, how much more fit we would be, how much more capable we would be of getting up and down and not losing our balance and not falling and things. But in each of the cultures, things like that of constant movement, of doing activities that require physical strength, milking the goats in some areas where they had livestock. They were still, milking the goats and carrying pails of milk, and they were still, grinding wheat on a hand grinder. Um, Things like that, that they were having to actually move and prepare their meals and prepare their lifestyle, washing their clothes by hand and all those things. And so it just kept them moving constantly. And we think, well, we don't have that problem anymore. We're able to have machines that do all that stuff for us. What do we need to do then to make up for that? So one of the communities that was one of these blue zones was Loma Linda, California, among a group of Seventh-day Adventists who, funny enough, are mostly vegan or vegetarian. I'm not sure. I think vegetarian. I think they still do fish and things, but so they eat a very healthy lifestyle. They eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, and that's a big like tenet of their religion. But what that creates is having to prepare that food, and so they do a lot more in food prep. But they also have created communities. They tend to live in tight knit communities, and in those communities, they tend to be very active. So they do a lot of sports, and they have rec centers and things like that where they go and have sponsored fitness times and do recreational activities together, and they have adult leagues for different sports and activities and things like that. So they've found ways in a modern society to still have regular activity, and where people even in their 80s, 90s, hundreds are participating in those activities. So I thought that was fascinating that they're still um, living in these tight communities and still participating in all the things that create a tight community. Um, and that's one of the things that helped people live longer. And that's essentially what our ancestors did. They lived in small villages where they knew everybody, and um, they participated in like the community in so many ways, in the activities of the community, in serving others. That was actually another thing that in those tight-knit communities that they showed was that service was a regular part for everybody. Um, that that they all seemed to have some way in which they gave back to the community, where they contributed to other people. When someone got sick, they rallied around them and was able to, uh, you know, give of their time and their care to others, and that seemed to be a central theme in those blue zone areas of what helped people live longer was having those close knit relationships and being able to care and living in a tight community like that. So um, I thought all of those things were fascinating that they kept moving and that there's a modern society in which people are still doing this. They kept moving. They were eating real good, locally sourced food, and that they lived in this tight community. Um, so I guess my question to all of you is, how do we create something like that in our modern society? To me, that's one of the more important things is how do we replicate that same thing? And that's something that since I've watched this that I've been thinking about. How can Body Smart help fill that role? We're trying to do this online community, these group calls and things like that to create more of an online community, um, so that we can, rally around one another and all kinds of other benefits. But, how do we do that? How do we um, create that same kind of community, that same kind of movement and things in our lifestyles? Um, that's tricky. It's tricky to know how to replicate that what our ancestors had and what we kind of don't really a lifestyle we don't really live anymore. Um, I I'd love to see us go back to doing some of those things. Um, from a food standpoint, it really is more challenging than just going to the grocery store and buying pre-prepared food that's really calorie dense but not very nutritionally dense, that doesn't have a lot of good whole fiber and things like that. How do we solve that problem of getting back to grocery stores carrying real locally sourced food, farmers markets and things like that, and less of the manufactured foods, less of the foods that really aren't good for us. um, how do we get back to just moving more consistently? I've talked with many of you, and I talk with people about this all the time of like it's more about getting just more steps in your day, more movement, about living the active lifestyle, more than it is exercising more. Exercise is not where we lose weight. We've talked about that before. It's not in exercising that we lose weight. It's in living the active lifestyle. So how do we change our lifestyle so that we're moving more like our ancestors did, and that we replace some of our sedentarism, our driving from place to place instead of walking or biking? Or how do we change that in our communities? I would love to hear your suggestions and things that you're doing or have tried to do to kind of get back to that, or ideas that you might have, because I think all of those things are critical. How do we create tighter communities where people are more connected? One of the things that they showed was, in each of those blue zones, they all had a very strong uh, religious background, which was interesting. And I think, you know, uh, just from a very like pragmatic viewpoint, that religious background gave them hope and faith in themselves and other people, and gave them a community, so people to be tight knit with, and to be able to love and serve and have that community with. Um, so how do we create those types of groups and friendship groups? A lot of the people that were living into their hundreds were people who, um, yeah, had a tight group of friends that they did things together with often. So how do you create that? Okay, so got some comments coming in. I've seen some people typing for the past little bit. So Shannon says, we've made our lives so complicated where we are so busy that preparing healthy meals is really difficult. I love eating healthy whole foods, but it really is so much more labor intensive. Maybe we all need chefs. It's interesting, but I've been thinking about that because I totally agree with you. It is. It is so much more labor intensive. But what was interesting is that is part of where they got that community sense of they would often get together with the whole family to make that food. They would often, that's where so much of their movement and activity came from. It wasn't high level activity. It was just being on your feet and moving and preparing that food. That's where so much of their movement and activity came from. It was just putting food on the table. We are so over programmed in our life and lifestyles right now that is very difficult, where we've got something to do um, all the time, and so we don't plan in time, or that's not part of our lifestyle, is our food prep. Where in very kind of old world countries and old world areas of those countries, where people are in those blue zones where they're living longer and living better, more whole, full lives, they've actually still lived in communities where they've slowed down, where they're not busy all the time, where they're not, um, just packed to the gills with activities that are sedentary activities, appointments and things like that. One of the other things about their communities that was interesting is that they tended to live near family. Um, that in those blue zone areas, family, they either lived with or near family, and they were very tight knit families that cared for one another and cared for them as they got older. So that, interestingly enough, they were more able to live independently when they had family that lived close, because when they got sick or when they got ill, they could take care of them and get them back to a level where they were able to live on their own again. Uh, which is fascinating that they didn't put people in nursing homes. So all of those areas did not have nursing homes, which was fascinating. The people were living in their own homes or living with family until the end of their lives. I thought that was an interesting connection or correlation. Um, so that living with and near family allowed them to help each other with a lot of those things, like the meal prep. That was one of the things that they often did, was eat uh, at least one of those meals together every day, which is interesting and fascinating. That allowed them, though, not only the social connection and that closeness, but allowed them to move and get in that healthy movement. So interesting. Sam says, biking, walking to work, and running errands, things like that. Yeah, finding ways to make your life less efficient. We often try to find ways to make our life more efficient. Even carrying the groceries in, we often try to get them all at once versus taking multiple small trips. Things like that, we can get more steps, more movement in our day even. But biking, walking, really, if you can get there by bike or by walking, you should. Um, saving time, but saving time for what? Sometimes we have to ask ourselves that. Like, would my time be better spent moving on my way there? Would my head be more clear? Would I have time to think about what I'm going to do there and things like that? There's a lot of benefits from being on our feet and walking and moving and doing. And so, yeah, things to think about how we can switch up our life and lifestyle. Our commute in the morning. Do we live too far away from our work where it makes walking or riding our bike too difficult, where that makes that too big of a challenge? Could we live or work closer to where um, or could we bring those things closer? Could we live in a community where we're with more like-minded people that are trying to do those same things for our health? I mean, there's pros and cons to that. Living, in diverse areas where you live with people who are like-minded can help challenge your mindsets and things like that, which I think are good. Um, but but it seems to be that a lot of the people that live the longest and live like those whole full lives do live close to people that support them and can build a community. So it's fascinating. Um, I saw somebody else was typing a comment as well. Um, don't hesitate. I think it was Jason. Don't hesitate to drop that comment. So one of the last things that we haven't talked about yet, that is one of those key things that our ancestors had that we seem to lose, especially in retirement. And we often see that people's health is very much like a cliff where they maintain a certain level of health until retirement, and then kind of right before or at retirement, their health just drops off a cliff, and they become very sedentary, and their health becomes very poor rapidly. Um, and we see people that were mentally sharp and able to do their job and things like that into their mid 60s, and as soon as they retire, by their early 70s, are quite unhealthy, quite incapable of much physical activity, and their cognitive decline is very, very rapid. And so, what causes that in a relatively short period of time, within 5 to 7 years, that we see such a rapid decline in their physical, mental health, in their just capability to live their own lifestyle. And it would seem that a lot of that is tied into they lack a sense of purpose of why they're still kicking. They retired, and so now what? Um, and that is a fascinating concept. That without purpose, um, people become very uh, much less likely to do, and more likely to become sedentary, to not really work on something or develop themselves or keep doing. And so what all of those communities seemed to have was everyone had a role and a purpose. What they call in one of the cultures in Okinawa, they called it the ikigai. Um, that is your kind of greater purpose, and your role in the community is your ikigai. Um, and so I think that's fascinating that they had a specific role within the community, whatever that is. So, in some of the communities that they showed, it was they were sheep herders, and so they still had to get up and care for those animals every morning, or they built instruments, or they served in community centers, or everyone just had a reason why they got up in the morning and their role within the community. Um, and I think that's a fascinating concept. What is going to be my purpose when I retire? What is the thing that I still want to do and contribute to society? I think a lot of people feel like, well, I can't offer anything to society anymore. I know. So I was talking with this gentleman just this weekend whose purpose was doing genealogical work. Um, he is in his late 70s, early 80s, I believe. Um, and his whole purpose for the last couple of decades was doing genealogical work. He was an engineer for the Forest Service, and now he um, really doesn't have a purpose, because 2 years ago his eyesight had been failing for a while. But 2 years ago it was declared that he was 98% blind. He had a 55-inch TV screen that he was using his computer monitor, that he had just a few inches away from his face, and so the letters were blown up to about 6 inches tall, and he got to the point where he could no longer read that even, and so he was unable to do his genealogical work anymore, and he just doesn't even know who he is, what to do with himself, and his physical health now especially has really deteriorated. um, and so, interesting how when we lose our sense of purpose, we often deteriorate very rapidly. But that's an important part of our health, even though it's not necessarily one of the key health metrics that we track, right? What's your purpose? We don't have that as one of the 5 patterns, but maybe we should in some way, that we have a specific purpose to what we're doing with our life. But I do think that gives us a sense of direction to what we're doing, and a sense of why we want to exercise regularly and move enough, why we want to eat healthy foods and things like that. What is it that we're fueling if we're not fueling a specific purpose? Why are we moving and exercising? And why do we want to maintain a certain level of health if we don't have a purpose to that? So I think that purpose is so critical in sustaining, maintaining our healthy lifestyle. I think what happens to a lot of people is they see their kids become independent and their kids move away and things like that. And it's like, well, I'm not really needed in my kids' life. I still love my kids and grandkids, and I want to be there for them, and I want to see them and things like that. But I don't feel like I'm needed necessarily in their lives. They're independent. And so we tend to kind of lose that sense of purpose and why I'm there. I think that's another aspect of the tight-knit community, is when you're very involved in people's lives, everyone has something going on, and it allows you to be able to serve more when we're more involved, and gives you a greater sense of purpose, and you can see those gaps in somebody's life that you can help fill. And so I think that tight-knit community really does help with that sense of purpose. But it's finding that, and kind of declaring that, like, this is my role in the community. I know one gentleman in my neighborhood who's still able to do 10 pull-ups and still able to do all these things. Very, very fit guy. And he's in his mid 80s, but his purpose, he lives, I guess one of his kids and her husband and their child live with him. He exercises every day and spends several hours at the gym, because that's kind of his social connection too. But then he also serves in the jail system, and he goes and meets with and counsels these inmates, and does that several days a week. And those things, that connection and that sense of community, really has helped him live not just longer but better. He's more connected to the community because of that. So he's got that sense of purpose that really has helped him live a healthier, more active, better lifestyle. So I love that. So we need to find, I guess, or declare and seek out what is going to be my purpose in life moving forward. So those are kind of the observations that I've had. I'd love to hear any suggestions from you about what you feel like helps lead that active lifestyle, or ways that we can incorporate some of those principles of having a purpose, of moving more and eating real foods and things like that our ancestors were doing, that the people that are still living their healthiest, the healthiest centenarians, what they're doing. I'd love to hear your suggestions. So don't hesitate to drop those in the comments, or message me directly if you've got ideas. But we would love to help find ways through Body Smart to encourage people to be able to do these same things, to follow these same steps, so that they can live healthier and live better for longer. So anyway, that's kind of the lessons from the past that I wanted to share with you today, and that I'm trying to find ways to incorporate into my life and lifestyle. So thanks so much for joining us on the call today. We've got the call coming up tomorrow evening as well. Mark should be back, I think. So he was at a training thing in Oregon, and so hopefully he'll be back here with us. And we will continue on that call. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Becoming Body Smart podcast. If you have questions, thoughts, or want to continue the conversation, reach out to us on our socials or join our community. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It helps us bring you even more valuable content. Remember, sustainable health is a lifelong journey, and and we're here to support you every step of the way. Live longer, live stronger, and become Body Smart.